Good morning. In the first place, I would like to thank the authorities of the colloquium.
Buenos días. En primer lugar, deseo darle las gracias a las autoridades del coloquio de IDEA por este error de haberme invitado a mí. En primer lugar, deseo también felicitarlos
For this opportunity.
por la elección del nombre de este coloquio. La motivación del mismo.
First of all, I would also like to congratulate you on the selection of the name of this colloquium.
La referencia del si no es ahora cuándo está tomado.
The motivation of the same, where the reference of if it is not now, when, is taken. I do not know if you know it or not, but from the book of Ev 1.14, which refers to Hillel and says he used to say, if I am not for me, who is for me? Even if it is for me alone, what am I, if not now, when? Basically, what I'm going to do is lay out the business case for Argentina, because the time is now, and basically I'm going to do a first part where I'm going to explain why this time it is different, and then I am going to present Argentina directly as a case for investment. Basically, one should wonder why this time it will be different. Because in fact the book of Reinhardt and Robert is precisely a narration of how many times it was said that this time it will be different, and it always ended in the same way. In the Argentine case it always ended badly, so it is a little more challenging to explain why this time it will be different. But it is also true that at some point there may be a trend change. A structural change and a change that starts a new era. In fact, the 37th generation was precisely working to make it different this time as well. That did it because when in 1860 the AddEA constitution was put in place, Argentina went from a barbaric country to a first world power in 35 years. So the central idea of this presentation is to show why that is feasible and why this time it can be different. Naturally, to explain why this time it is different is that we cannot leave aside the initial conditions with which we faced ourselves, because also the way in which we have resolved this makes the argument that this time it will be different. Basically, at the time of assuming office, we faced what was potentially the worst crisis in Argentine history. It combined the worst elements of the three biggest crises in Argentine history. We had a monetary imbalance, or surplus of money, the money overhang, which was twice as much as the one we had during Rodriguez. Consider that at that time, when the central bank ran out of dollars and there was nothing left to open and evaluate, the inflation rate multiplied by 6 times. If it was twice, imagine that we had been traveling at 200%, we were going to 1200 base, and if it was twice 2400. On the other hand, when one takes the situation of the central bank in terms a passive remuneration with respect and 1 or 2 base, the situation was much worse. And that of the central bank at the beginning of 1989, prior to the hyperinflation of Alfonsin, which ended at 5,000%. At the same time, the social indicators were worse than what we had in the previous outbreak of the convertibility. Therefore, it is clear that the situation was extremely complex and that any error would have detonated a crisis of very difficult proportions. To imagine, but that in light of what each of these crises were, it is not difficult to imagine that at least the poverty had doubled. Therefore, we would have been at levels of at least 90% or a little more, surely half the population. The basic symptom of all this was reflected in what was the inflation rate. Here there is always a discussion whether it is valid or not to be making the annualizations. From my point of view, it is valid because it is at the rate that the prices are moving. And there were elements that allowed a monetary validation that indeed validated them in them. Facts. In fact, the day we took charge of the administration, in my opening speech, I explained how the account was made. In reality, I did it from the monetary point of view, because in fact I did not yet have the data, for example, of what the major price index of December was. In the first week of December, the prices were growing at 1% per day, which is 3,700% per year. When he looked at the second week, there had been an acceleration and the prices began to travel at a rate of 7,500 per year. And when he take the wholesale inflation, which is, I usually always work with the wholesale inflation, because it is usually a leading indicator, that is to say, it is usually ahead of what happens with consumer inflation, and that month was 54%. In annualized terms, it is 17,000%. Therefore, there is no doubt that if this had exploded, we would be talking about an absolutely different situation. So, the first thing we clearly had to was stop inflation. Here it is important, as always, have a proper diagnosis. Unfortunately, thanks to that huge team that I have, that Total Capital leads, we could hit the ground running. We start with the hypothesis that inflation is always, in every way, a monetary phenomenon generated by an excess of money supply, either because the demand falls, because the supply rises, or because both things happen, which lead to a loss of the purchasing power of money and consequently all the prices expressed in monetary units rise. Meant that in the very definition that I use about the origin of inflation and about how I look at inflation, I do not define it as the increase in prices, but as the loss of the purchasing power of money. That is, I do not have that bad habit of many politicians who believe that it is the fault of the entrepreneurs who charge high prices. I still remember my predecessor in office who said that inflation is produced by the devil. He said the force of the sky killed them both. And because that very definition of inflation is where prices rise, it is what allows some overnighter to think that can be solved with price controls when that has never worked in the history of humanity. And if there's a place where it never worked, it was in Argentina. So the point was good to trace the origins of the monetary emission, and also here it was interesting because another thing that exploded in the eyes of anyone who looked at the Argentine case was the twin deficits. Think that when a country has 4% of the GDP of twin deficits, it is a yellow alarm. 8% is a red alarm because they are on their way to hit the pine tree. We had 17. More or less to have an order of magnitude from the challenge. Now those 17. 15 were in the public sector, 5 in the treasury and 10 in the central bank. So basically the iDEA was good to attack the problem of the public sector and to attack the problem of the central bank. And it is in that context we developed the zero deficit program. I remember that when we campaigned with a chainsaw, many laughed at it. They also said it was impossible. And also, if one looked at the Argentine history, it seemed quite complicated because of the last 123 years Argentina had a deficit of 113. The 10 that it did not have is because Argentinos in default. And also when one took the amount of crisis using the methodology of Ana Mario Cerro and Isolde Maloney, Argentina from 1901 to today had 23 crises, where 21 had a fiscal origin and where they are allocated between a high fiscal deficit and fiscal waste directly. There are a lot of other things that do the inheritance and this. I do not want to repeat much because I have said it in other places and I want to leave myself more time to discuss the Argentine case, but that which seemed virtually impossible. That it could not be adjusted more than 1 point per year, that we were not going to ever achieve it. Well, we achieved it in the first month of management, that is, in the first month of management we achieved what in 123 years the Argentine economy had never achieved. Naturally, in the face of this achievement, it was achieved in the first month. By the way, we were also surprised, I believe, in the motorcycle. Sierra, everything did it better. There they began to question the quality of the place to recognize that the Econechantes mantras were wrong. They began with the fact that it does not have a lot of liquid and scissors and all those little things of these kiskas that are not the heirs of Adam. Smes for shell. I do, they do not. But that said, beyond the parochial jokes, basically the first thing we did was reduce the number of ministries from 18 to 9. Today we already have 8 ministries. In addition, the public work was eliminated. They said that it was very hard to touch the public work. Of course, because that's where politicians steal, and if we were going to make a government of honest people, the first thing we had to cut was the public work. Another thing that they said that it was impossible to touch because it was a great job for politicians was the discretionary transfers to the provinces. In general, what they were trying to do was make those transfers to those provinces as opaque as possible, precisely so that in that way they could steal. Naturally, the discretionary transfers to the provinces had to go. Another thing that they said that it was impossible to do is to touch public employees. Not only that, we have already fired almost 50,000 public employees. but also that every time a contract falls, in most cases, it is not renewed. Therefore, we also narrowed down the number of public employees. Then there's a very interesting part. It happened at a cabinet meeting. We were gathered, and in the middle of the meeting, Torcha had to go to a meeting outside Coserizo, and then he got up and I stayed with the rest of the ministers. Then, once he left, I asked each of the ministers explicitly. I told them that I wanted them to also reduce 10% more of each of them expenses of each of the ministries. The most surprising thing is that the following week, each of the ministers brought me a program of reduction and efficiency of the spending, lowering the public spending by 10%. While that is through a commitment with management. Another thing that we did, and that also seemed impossible, was to eliminate the intermediaries. That is, to get the managers of poverty out of the way. This was one of the battles. Probably the hardest ones that we had to fight. This was a battle that was led by the Minister of Human Capital, Sandra Pedovilo, the Minister of Security, Dr. Boric, and Dr. Guillermo Faro, who is an infrastructure, where basically what was raised, because it was what appeared in the headlines, and the reason why it caused so much criticism of Minister Pedovilo was that the counterfeiting of the plan was eliminated. Then they came out to criticize us, saying that now we wanted to give plans without counterfeiting, and that what we were doing was to promote vacancy, that is, as if we were even worse than the populists who had left, and that is, not understanding what was going on with that. We, first of all, were clear that due to the type of adjustment that we were making, it was very likely that the strongest impact would be felt during the first quarter. Therefore, it was also important to do it during vacation so that people would not find out so much, so to speak, in some way, about what was happening. On the other hand, we had to make sure that the most vulnerable sectors did not feel the brunt of the adjustment, so it was very important to give them with tension. The problem is that there was no money, so where are we going to get the resources from? It is true that we also made an adjustment of 5 and overreacted and made an adjustment of 7. And then we could continue to recompose other gains. But here it was key that it was also what fueled and fed the pickets, which also said that it was impossible to end with them, and that, thanks to his measure and the anti-pickets protocol of that wonderful minister that I have, who is Dr. Boric. Today, we live in an Argentina that does not have pickets, something that also seemed impossible and that we have achieved since the first day of management. In their context, something happened that was that all the people believe that, as the beneficiaries, other plans received a card that prevented there being intermediaries, and, in fact, that did not prevent there being intermediaries, because although they charged within card, at the moment they had to leave the constancy that they had lent the service. At that moment was when they charged the toll, and there was when they took out half of the plan, Then suddenly they had two plans, and a plan they had to leave, let's say,
llevar los cupones que le daban
to the deaf picketers so that they could continue to charge a plan.
entonces
And how was the loan? To take the coupons that they gave them on the marches,
entonces qué es lo que
to show that they had been on the marches. So one of the things that we did is
cuenta de que habían hecho algo y por ende
remove the obligation of that loan. So what happened? The people were now
duplicaron los ingresos en el medio del ajuste.
obliged to go and realize that they had done something, and therefore, without a spending
Eso le quitó recursos a los piqueteros, a los
a single peso more, the income was doubled in the middle of the adjustment.
ante la
But at the same time, it took away resources from the picketers, from the
por eso era muy importante lo que pasaba en la primera
managers of poverty. That is why it was so important to have the anti-picket protocol quickly. And that is why what happened in the first battle that we were going to have was very important.
Massa durante toda la campaña diciendo todo tipo de aberraciones
And in that context, the transport system, instead of using it to make a negative campaign,
como por ejemplo que voy a arancelar las universidades o que las quiero cerrar
as Massa did during the entire campaign, saying all kinds of aberrations, which is,
esa campaña negativa
to this day of this, I have to continue explaining that they are lies, such as that I'm going to
que yo les haría es ustedes
cancel universities, or that I want to close them, or that I want to privatize them. So they
están a afanar
used all that negative campaign to prevent us from auditing them.
la pregunta
So the question
ni las universidades no van a
that I would ask you is, are you in favor of the picketers and that they do not audit them,
y no harán
and that they use the universities for politics?
queremos esas
Because that is the question.
y sin embargo tengo que seguir respondiendo por esto
Universities are not going to be privatized. They are going to be public and not be cancelled. The only thing we want to do is audit them, and however, I have to continue
en ese contexto
responding to this. And in that context, our line of complaints was but so that they would not
para que no se dejaran extorsionar y obviamente sacamos 18.000 efectivos a la calle ya que Beliboni amenazaba con una manifestación de 50.000
be allowed to extort.
decía que iba a
And obviously we put 18,000 employees on the street since Wilborny,
mega éxito y la manifestación terminaron
threatened with a manifestation of 50,000 and internally said that it was going to be 100,000.
desde la Argentina
So that's how it was shown as a mega success.
también
And the manifestation
porque ustedes tienen
ended up being 3,000 people, and from that day on the picketers and Argentina ended.
pierde el que se
Wow, it was a good move too, because you have three types of wars. You have wars,
flujo contra flujo no terminan nunca o tienen
stocks against stocks. You lose the one that ends first. You have wars that are
lo tonto que había sido la política argentina en este
flows against flows. They never end. Or you have wars that are flows against stocks.
y este diseño entre la doctora Petovela
The silly thing that Argentine politics had been in this aspect was that the enemy was
en una guerra de flujos contra stock y el flujo lo tenía
giving it flows all the time.
stock lo tenían
And this design between Dr. Patovolo, Dr. Orich,
y después
and Dr. Ferrara made it become a war of flows against stocks. And the flow
y efectivamente es lo que hicimos pero bueno en el medio hubo que
was ours and the stock was theirs.
que estábamos
They were going to make a strong bet, and then
así que cuando van por la capital y pueden
different marches were going to be deflated. And indeed, that's what we did.
Milei
But well, in the meantime, we had to endure the criticism that we were promoting. So that when you go for the capital and can comfortably walk, say, sorry, my lady,
¿sí? Una licuación de salarios en el sector público y obviamente que eso también, digamos, impactó las jubilaciones. Jubilaciones que hoy están arriba del 10% de
naturally this also happened. Yes, a payment balancing in the public sector, and obviously,
estaban en noviembre. Y no solo eso, sino que
and that also impacted the rentals.
se triplicaron.
Rentals that today are above 10% of what was above inflation,
Dios, básicamente fue el programa de la motosierra, algo que no
and above what was in November.
metimos con un montón de vacaciones
And not only that, but also in dollars they tripled.
públicas, con las transferencias, nos metimos
That was basically the program of the Mertosi era, something that was never done. And we got involved with a lot of sacred cows, because we got involved with the public works. With the transfers, we got involved with everything. We got involved with the managers of poverty. Therefore, it was not impossible. We just had to have the courage to do it. And we had it. On the other hand, that only fixed a third of the problems. We still had the problem of the central bank. What was the fiscal deficit? And what implied the endogenous emission of money? And therefore, if we wanted to conflation, we had to end the fiscal crisis. It was also very important to start systematically showing the fiscal balance, and that it was something that had come to stay, and that it was not something transitory. Because here there is something very important. If I go to deficit zero, the increase in debt is zero. Therefore, the debt-product relationship is not growing. And if the debt-product relationship is not growing, one is solvent in the meantime, and sooner or later the risk of the country will collapse. And we got in office, it was close to 3,000, and today it is fighting to break the 1,000. So it seems that we are also doing well there. And it is not that it is going down. Due to a type 2 air problem, I think that having achieved it, based on having its fiscal solvency, is an achievement and very far from regrettable. I mean, that's why the ink burn is brain. So in that cleaning of the central bank, we had to deal with the issue of the remunerated passives. In fact, what a la lecura. Let's say it were instruments of 30, 60, 90, 180, 270 days. The previous government had gone through it all in one day, in such a way that if the crisis broke out, the amount of money could be multiplied by 5 in one day. Obviously, that would have caused a brutal inflationary explosion. And by the end of the year, we would no longer be in power. And the case would return to the government. But with all their dirty work done, well, we didn't give them the pleasure. They're still eating popcorn. They must be this fat. In fact, with all the dust that was taken away from the cleaners, it will surely be able to stay well round. So, there is also the issue of the remunerated passives. And we also fought a very important battle at the beginning. Because what a large part of the economics profession suggested to us was that we raise the interest rates, that we take it to a positive level. The real interest rate. And the reality is that if we had done that, today we would be arguing about a passive monetary relationship against the base of more than 10 times, and we would be arguing about the carry trade. We would be arguing about when we would be able to fly through the air, and we would be arguing that the inflation doesn't go down because of the expectation of emissions, since those remunerated passives are future emissions, consequently never went down, which would have been a huge mistake. There's obviously a whole discussion about whether to use the interest rate or not. I mentioned that at the last meeting of the central bank. But what we decided was to adjust the rate in dollars, given the jump and the type of change, which was neither more nor less than reality. It makes me laugh at the intellectual dishonesty of some saying my law came in devalued, as if the gap didn't exist, and as if a central bank had to blow up reserves. I mean, really, there are people who, I don't know if you don't listen, don't read what they write. You can be so dishonest intellectually. But when you adjust the rate in dollars, and in a process of stabilization, and with an honest price, it will be obvious that the interest rate in pesos is still negative in real terms, which could be adjusted with the rate in dollars, and that at the same time allowed us to liquefy the paid pressures. And meanwhile, we continued to consolidate a fiscal balance. And when the solidity of the fiscal balance was already clear, they began a huge task of the Secretary of Finance, Pablo Kirchner, in conjunction with the central bank, where they began to remove the paid passives from the balance of the central bank and began to go where they should have always gone, which was to the Treasury, because in the end, those paid passives arose from having generated the fiscal deficit, from having financed it with monetary emissions, and that or another window to get it out by paying taxes, so that the fiscal problem became a problem of future inflation. And that is also interesting, because nobody said how to solve it. When the answers, when we raised this, were absolutely laughable. And nobody knew how to solve it. Well, we solved it in 6 months. And the 7th month ended the fiscal deficit. Something that seemed impossible. But we also made it possible. And after we managed to close the gap between the paid pesos, we moved on to the scheme of zero money supply excess. I remember that I presented that in a trade rad, and I explained that we were only going to buy dollars. That is, that the only source of emissions that was going to remain was the purchase of dollars. And one of the things that we realized was that we were wrong with that scheme. If you take the traditional books of international monetary economy, you will find that when someone goes and sells a dollars, or in other words, buys money from the central bank, that has a demand for money and does not generate inflation. Well, that is true in a world when there is no capital controls. When you have capital controls, you go and buy money not because you want to, but because you are obliged. And therefore, it is a differential between what you would like to have and what you are actually buying, and that generates pressure on the level of prices. And in the face of a speculative attack, where the dollar was trading at 1,500 pesos, and they anticipated that the following week it would go to 2,000 and so on, we decided to change the monetary scheme and go directly to zero emissions. Well, it's something that never happened in Argentina. It worked. That is that the dollar fell from 1,500 to 1,100. So that which seemed impossible, we made possible. Sir, the result of all this is that wholesale inflation, which was at 54%, that is to say, annualized at 17,000. On the day of the 4, the consumer inflation was known as the last data. And basically, the September inflation was 2%. That is to say, from inflation at 17,000, we reached 28%, and there is no doubt that we will continue to lower it. In addition, it is also very interesting how this was achieved, because this also makes it different this time around, because we did not do it by having a prior hyperinflation. That would imply profound liquefaction of the financial assets in such a way that the stabilization would be quick. We also achieved this without an expropriation, because we did not have a prior hyperinflation, or a compulsive renegotiation, or a default, or any other equivalent. That is why, when they said, when would we finish cleaning up the remunerated assets? I don't know. The answer is, I am not a director, I'm a liberal. And this is a marked process, and we will end up cleaning up the remunerated assets. I don't know. The answer is I am not a director, I am a liberal. And we will end up cleaning up the remunerated assets when market agreement allows us to move them to another instrument. Therefore, this is also a novelty for the Argentine economy, which we did without expropriation and without a default. Another important characteristic is that we are doing all this without price controls, which also makes a big difference. On the other hand, we also did it without setting the type of change, because if you set the type of change, this will happen faster. And as if all this were not enough, we did it in our recomposition of relative prices. The previous government had left the prices very high, and we are recomposing them. And today the prices cover more than 80% of the costs. Therefore, this is a truly different way of reducing inflation compared to how the previous programs were done in the case of Argentina. And as if all this were not enough, one could say, well, but what happened in terms of activity? NAC. The most similar program in terms of adjustment that was made in Argentina was much smaller than this, but of important magnitude. Was what happened with Duvalda in 2003. That year, the GDP fell by 10.9%. And in the second quarter, which is when the adjustment was fully implemented, the economy fell by 16%. In fact, days ago, Vice Minister Dazo said that all the experiences of strong adjustments, not like the ones we made, but important adjustments. In each of those cases, the GDP had fallen by at least 10%. I tell you that if we take the last data from ME, the station, and compare it with November and December, the fall is barely 0.6%. If you want to measure in the industry with the last data, it's already at the same levels as November. That is, there was a negative impact in the first quarter, and it already started to reverse. Therefore, the economic program was so well designed that it also meant not having to suffer heavily in terms of economic activity. And today, the use of the installed capacity is already above what we had last year. But it wasn't all about stabilization. I mean, not only was there a stabilization program, but also set of structural reforms was made. And between the 7023 executive order and the Business law, the reform we made was 8 times bigger than that of Menem. But the situation was that the reform that Menem made was the biggest in the history of Argentina. Therefore, I want you to have a historical context that we are living in a government that made the biggest structural reform in the history of Argentina. That is different also. And what does that imply? It implies that we are going to jump 90 positions in times of economic freedom. And those countries that are free are 12 times richer than the repressed. They have 25 times less poverty in the standard format and 50 times less in the extreme format. And we are moving towards institutions that today could compare with those that Germany, France, Italy, any of the countries in Europe. Therefore, in the meetings, Juan Pablo Nicolini presented a work on maintaining fiscal balance. With that, we would have the potential to double the GDP in 10 years. That is a rate of growth in the GDP of 7% per capita. And as if all this were not enough, I have the luxury of a minister. He is a colossus federicus desnega. He regulates something every day. That is, there is no day that Federico does not make me happy the day I read his Twitter account. Thank you, Federico.
Porque una vez que hable del RIGI, ahí voy a empezar a ver.
And now is when we are going to. I'm going to start selling the Argentine case to you. Because once I talk about the RIGI, I'm going to start to see. I'm going to talk about Argentina as if it were a business. The RIGI. There, I took active participation in the structure of the RIGI. And if you don't like the regulator, he can break me. Because I was deeply involved and I put my hands in there. So all my fingers are marked. You're going to see all my dirty fingers. I have it all. So now I'm going to tell you what I got into. So if Vaticans, those who ran, know that it's my fault. One of the things that we especially put in the RIGI with a respect of the economic financial equation of the business. If the economic financial equation of the business is the account that you use for when you calculate the value of a company, if you have a regulated company, for example, and basically what a regulated company does is that it makes a quasi-rental note. It implies that it's going to have a return similar to the cost of opportunity, which in a regulated company is also regulated, so to speak, in some way. And in that sense, for example, in the case of a regulated company, you are looking for a price path such that the VAT is zero. That is, the internal rate of return tower is equal to the average cost, WACC, in such a way that you can rewrite here, in terms of the necessary income to cover the cost of operation and maintenance, the tax cost and the capital return. In other words, there's different ways of describing that same equation. But the most interesting thing about that equation is that it has an element that allows you to quantify the effects of the atrocities that the state can cause, whether it's raising taxes, whether it's modifying or creating new taxes. Or modifying the rules. In the case of a regulated company, it's easier said than done, because it would be a modification in regulation. But suppose you are a company that is dedicated to the rent of officers, and a government appears and gives you the rent law, which is impossible to touch. We did it on the first day, and while it's working. So the fact of incorporating the financial economic equation of a business makes that every time the state or a government wants to do tax policy, by harming the private sector, the cost of the policy will be much greater than the positive that it can generate. Therefore, we are tying our feet in hands to future politicians. We too, but since we don't want to do that kind of thing, look at this. We are going to a deficit zero scheme and zero emission scheme in an electoral year. Can you tell me which politician in the world has done that? In this deficit zero scheme? Can you tell me which politician in the world has done that in the history of humanity? Because from my point of view, it never happened. At the same time, another thing we put in the RIGI, in their original version, there is a choice of 3 courts. So you could choose one of those 3 courts. In those 3 courts, the modification that occurred to me is that one chooses a court. What if, as time goes by, one is not happy with that court, one can change it. That is, that they have flexibility. That if a court does not give the answer they want, one can change the court. That is the joke of politicians, who end up expropriating the creators of wealth. That will end up. Because if one does not respond to a court, they will go to another. But in addition, that was not enough for me. I wanted a little more. That day I was quite insatiable, it seems. It must be because I come from the private sector. Another thing that came to my mind was to add a local court. Because when one looks at the experience of other cases, international courts always require a lot of time. On the other hand, with local courts, things flows much faster. Now that local court is forced to take the results that defense competition generates. And defense of competition is going to have a special unit for rigging. And those who follow rigging contracts, rigging situations, will have to know about micro. They will have to know about macro. They will have to know about law and economics. They will have to know about law. They will have to know about finance. And especially about the evaluation of companies and economic regulation. And they will have to. Now, let's say there will be an examination of income for all sides. But that examination will be designed by some notables and me. I mean, I'm not the notable. The notables are Federal Gasters Nega, Torture Cafuto, Santiago Vandacuzzi, and I'll add some extra evil. But let's say with which it will be a unit destined to take care of investors, with which they will always be able to opt for the local court under these circumstances. Why do I say this? Because already entering Argentina, if you wanted to evaluate a project, you would be looking at the flow of funds. Now, the flow of funds is wonderful, but you can have a phenomenal business. But if later the state or government comes and expropriates them, I mean, the mechanism doesn't work. I mean, it's very important. Probably one of the most important institutions, together with respect to life and freedom, is the right to property. We repeat it all year. We said it was life, liberty, and property. And from here on, private property is going to be respected. It's going to be respected, because that's what's going to allow the savers to be able to save and be defended. In fact, the way in which we disarmed the situation of the central bank was to respect the right to property. And that also implies that we're not going to move forward on the results of the investment. For us, the one who earns money is not an evil. For us, the one who earns money is a social benefactor. I mean, he's a hero. I mean, he's someone who's arranging life for you, because he can only be successful by serving the neighbor at a better quality, at a better price. Therefore, far from persecuting him, we're going to celebrate him, we're going to applaud him in that. And in that situation where we respect savings, we respect investment, we respect the right to property, that's what's going to drive a process of accumulation of capital in terms of per capita. That's going to increase the productivity of Argentinians, and it's going to make us all richer. Therefore, that's clearly not negotiable. Like none of the basic parts of my program, as you may have already seen. I say that because when I said that if the degenerates, that we started this process of occultation at a low price, in places where there are less and less profits. I mean, before, we started doing other things. We started to generate capital. That's what I'm going to do today. The most important part of the program is first celebrate that this is the last wave of capital that we're going to make for a small group of people. So thank you very much. I'm not going to get involved in promoting something in particular. I don't pick the winners. This is very interesting because on many occasions, after a few nights, someone says, look, but you don't have a program. You don't have a stabilization program. And how did inflation drop by a miracle from 54% to 2%? What did I say? Inflation induced too, right? God, let's hope we get there and we achieve it in consumer. And we'll see what happens with the CPR later. Obviously, they already know it. But having said that, from our perspective, a stabilization program has three legs: a fiscal policy, a monetary policy, and exchange policy. In the fiscal, deficit zero. In the monetary, emission zero. And currency competition. Something that is already happening, so that those who have great fears about exchange appreciation, don't worry. We are allowing the offer and demand of dollars, matched voluntarily by individuals. Therefore, they're not going to have an abrupt drop in a type of change that is so fast that it does not allow them to adjust in the real sector and end up in bankruptcy. It is contemplated, but don't be afraid. Now they can make transactions in dollars and in any other currency. So cheer up. That is not a problem. Stop being scared by economists who seem to have died with the dinosaurs and have resurrected and maintained the same custom as the dinosaurs. Apart from that, it is clear that Argentina has sectors that are very interesting that I also suggest that they put when they do the analysis of the type of real change. First of all, the issue of the analysis of the type of real change is quite debatable, but it seems to me more questionable when they cut the series. Why did they cut the series in 2002 or 2003? Why didn't they cut it in 1991? Oh no, because that's where it's going to go down. So they can't come up with. There is no problem with the type of real change. In other words, with which, let's say, the problem that implies when they choose the date is not a minor issue. But even so, I warn you, for everything that is happening in times of energy, with everything that has to do with oil and gas, the most likely thing is that Argentina goes without a doubt to a much more appreciated currency level. I mean, why? Because there are huge opportunities in terms of oil and gas, taxally, with respect to property rights. Investments are going to appear. In fact, the RIGI already inquires for more than 50,000 millions of dollars in investments, and many companies are already investing. In fact, many of the companies are already issuing debt for low 8% in dollars, and Pampa himself did it at 5.75%. Therefore, be prepared, because a tremendous wave of dollars is coming from that sector. Obviously, with the presence of the RIGI, the investments in mining, let's say the most emblematic ones, would be copper and lithium, will also be making a great contribution. Without a doubt, I feel always, as we can grow, and low taxes, and we are going to go eliminate the restraints, and that will also allow the agricultural sector to expand more strongly. Therefore, the agro and mining have a lot to bring here. And obviously, in an economy that generates all this, it generates a lot of opportunities in terms of services. In fact, in an economy that for so long was destroying capital, the marginal return of capital is high. And it is not only the case in the microeconomics, which seems an abstraction. You know what it means, that the return on assets is enormous. That is, the return of the capital flow of the firm is enormous. Therefore, if we work hard to lower the cost of capital, the investments will follow very strongly. Another area is artificial intelligence. From our point of view, artificial intelligence is like a sort of industrial revolution, but reloaded. When you look at the statistics of the growth of the GDP per capita throughout the periods, that goes from the year zero of the Christian era until now, let's say that series is usually described as a hockey stick. It is a series that is practically constant during the first 1800 years and then hits a strong acceleration as a consequence of the impacts of the Industrial Revolution. Well, artificial intelligence is going to make that process seem like a child's game because it is going to be much deeper. And for artificial intelligence to develop, you need to have cheap energy in cold places and with high land extensions. Argentina, therefore. Also, let's say, for this I only say, to the facts of mere enunciation of sectors that do have huge potential that I am not going to explain to you because you are in the trench and you know it much better than I do, and there would be over fatal conceit type to believe that I can tell you something about your business, that you're the ones at the foot of the canyon, but only to mention them as cases, let's say, of things that can happen and are actually happening. And then they are the impacts of the macro on the flow of funds. And there we have elements that do in the short term and in the long term. In the short term, it has to deal with the cyclical recovery. At the beginning of the presentation, I talked about the use of the installed capacity, how it has been increasing, and basically that is what is pushing is the recovery of real wages. 5 months in a row, the real wages in Argentina have been increasing, and also the rents have been increasing in real terms. To that we also have to add the reversal of the stock cycle. That is, when we were at the end of the previous government, we had a way of covering the companies overstocked. And in that sense, in the first part of the year, they liquidated the stocks, and that deepened the fall of the first quarter. And now there is a replenishment of stocks, and that is one of the factors of causing cyclical recovery, which is positive. Obviously, then there is everything that has to do with long-term growth, and everything that has to do with structural reforms, and with what is being done in terms of regulation. And our objective is to become the freest country in the world. That also implies a strong drop in transaction costs. At the same time, there is a strong increase in savings. The fact of having run to the fiscal service and make a fiscal savings of 15 points of the GDP, those resources now that were consumed by the public sector are now available to the private sector, not for nothing. In December we discussed hyperinflation, and today we are discussing mortgage loans. 30 years of how a company could place debt in the local markets at 5.75%. Not only that, but also that the elimination of inflation, what it does is that it lowers the price distortion. That is, inflation has a harmful effect on the price system, and it is a transmission mechanism of information, of coordination and adjustment. And if you have inflation, what it does is that it flows with noise. I can be explaining here. I'm very good at explaining. It can be very talented people intellectually and understand without any kind of problem what I'm saying. But imagine that from now on, there begins to be noise and more noise. I keep explaining well. You are still very intelligent people, but noise does not allow us to communicate. That's what inflation does with the price system. And when it does, a loss of transactions are lost. There is a loss of efficiency and the allocation of resources. Well, iDEA emission program, what it assumes is that the central bank will never bother then again. And why do I say this? Because as the endogenous dollarization progresses, and they begin to make transactions and dollars really, there will be a moment that will be very big all the operating and dollars, and those operating in pesos will be very small. And when that situation is given, we will be in position to close the central bank and that politicians never again in life can scam them again with the inflationary tax.
Y el crecimiento, cuando ustedes toman la evidencia empírica en crecimiento económico,
On the other hand,
se llama convergencia.
I'm about to finish. Another thing that is very important in the business is growth and growth. When you take the empirical evidence in economic growth, there is a phenomenon called convergence. It's the situation under which a country that is left overreaches large countries that in Argentina could become a power in 35 or 40 years. The power, seriously, let's say, in the middle of the table, higher power. Let's see. When I speak, for example, my model is similar to Ireland. Ireland being the most miserable country in Europe in 40 years, today has a GDP 50% higher than of the United States. That is the point that I like. That Argentina is the country with the greatest economic freedom in the world that will not be prosperous. And then there is a situation. Let's say that this is convergence. Then actually, when one looks at the literature of the Austrians, this is very interesting because Hayek spoke of the market as a process of discovery. Then as you go, discovering things, then they grow. Now what is interesting, why those who come from behind can grow faster? Because the rest of the things were already discovered by others. The only thing they have to do is copy. That is to say, many of the businesses are already invented. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just have to bring them. That facilitates the growth and convergence. And obviously, we are generating the conditions from what we propose, from artificial intelligence, and from what we propose as a mechanism in what has to do with the institutional to promote a free economy, and that people can carry out their projects, and that there takes place a Peter in creative destruction, which is what later will make us grow when we are in the vanguard. But we have 30 minutes 40 years to copy from the beastful and move forward strongly. Therefore, this is not so difficult. And finally, the issue of the discount rate. As I told you, the fiscal solvency implies a fall in the Argentine risk, and that basically allows the discount rate goal. In fact, one of the things that we were doing with Cedric when we were discussing the topic of universities is that apart from the negative signal that implied to be giving in the tax numbers, and there at the same time implied to be doubled by the corrupt, because the problem is that they do not want to be audited. Then we were not even willing to double in front of the crowd, and we were not willing to give the tax numbers. But we said, well, let's make the account. What happens if one takes this increase? And one way he saw that when he gave that increase, in the background there is a very interesting book that goes stories of the fifth law and shows how after the original stabilization of the South, its ruin begins. Our indication of Alfonsina to give a quarter. Other point, teach one. TUI gives 0.25 to you 0.15. To everyone he gave everything. He ended up returning the fiscal deficit to a hyperinflation. Then what we did is, the exercise is good. Let's see the incremental effect of the money that goes to the universities. And let's go back to the unpresentable before. That is, let's go back to a world of 3,000 averse country. What has happened is that the unpresentable that had the country's risk in 3,000. They gave a lot of resources to the universities. And then they're the ones who say that they are going to defend. That's interesting. That is, those hypocrites are the directors, the ones who steal directly, easing the universities. But then we did in order, and it was in an exercise. We holes in. We cling to our fiscal policy, and I pay all the political costs. Then that makes the GDP stay $600,000 million. And if we give up and go back to the usual ways, it goes to $400,000 million. This is interesting because when you look in terms of resources for the universities, in dollars they are constant. That is solar increase, but in a more inundated macro, resources ended up being constant. But what is the problem with the most inundated macro? First, that the GDP per capita in dollars is lower for the important. Other drop in the GDP per capita in dollars is that it has two components. There is a component of drop in activity that is a third, but in the 2/3 remaining, it is by jump in the taifa. Real change, and that implies that it increases the amount of poor and needy. Therefore, as a business, not only was it by because the GDP per capita was smaller, but it also involved a multiplication and increase in that amount of poor and needy. Then when you are clear, the other thing that should be clear to you is that these people are not defending the university nor the interest of Argentinians. The only thing they want is to defend their cries and finish. I have not put a government that forces them to work, decently and stop working with politics. The other argument, I know already, it is the last one. So I'm finishing. I warn you. It is the reduction of macro volatility. If that reduction in volatility is an element that adds value, if you want a sharp ratio, it is going up. Obviously, in the perspective of real options, you could say, I have less volatility, then those options could be worth less. Well, all that macro volatility that we are getting, put all the volatility of the business, that it is free, that you believe in wealth, and that it is not because there is a creep of arrogant politicians ruining everyone's life. So I leave you that volatility in your hands. Therefore, being the flow funds rises, either because we respect the property rights, because we are not going to allow them to be expropriated, because basically there are business opportunities, because there is growth, and because at the same time the discount rate is falling. If I put myself as portfolio administrator, I would say long duration in Argentina. That is, Argentina is an asset to be bought long, and what can be done to the bought long is to make real investments. Therefore, Argentina is an excellent case for business. And then now, yes, I want to return to the original case of Percaibo. That is, and that I used to say, I am not. If I am not for me, who will be for me? That is, if I do not take care of myself, who is going to take care of me? That is more liberal and possible. That is, you are then responsible of your own destiny. You are the architects of your own future. That is, if you do not take care of yourself, who is going to do that? The state does not, because the state only does is damage, because the state does not produce nothing. When the state gives something, it is because someone stole it from someone. That is why we have done the most liberal policy in all of Argentina's history. We load the weight of the state on the private sector of about 13 points of the GDP, because we have made the biggest adjustment in history, because we have run the state in more than 6 points of the GDP. That say, if they only take the driver, therefore they were never so many freedoms return, also in such a short time. Therefore, that is, if you are not for you, if you did not take care of yourself, who is going to take care of yourself? It is more. And even if you take care of yourself, you yourself take care of yourself. The question is, what am I? What are you? You are entrepreneurs. You are the ones who create wealth. You are the social benefactors. You are the ones who have the key to make Argentina great again. You are the important ones responsible. You are the ones who can change this reality. We are only giving you a smooth playground, a playground at which you can play. We are giving you the roles. We are giving you the framework. But the creation of wealth will depend on you. That is, you are the ones who are going to stand up for Argentina. You are the ones who are going to make Argentina great again. And then the final question is, and if it is not now, when? It is now. It is now. Because this never happened in the history of Argentina. But for this to last, requires that it is successful. And this is going to be successful when there is growth. And growth is going to happen when you decide to put on your shoulders a role as entrepreneurs and go out and win the market. And that is what is going to bring us prosperity to all. So may God bless the Argentines. May the forces of heaven be with us, and long life freedom, damn it.